I'm making a short horror game where you play as a demonic vessel resisting a cult's exorcism. This video showcases how I made a PS2 style environment. I begin by collecting references. The game takes place at a dilapidated barn. For such a classic horror movie location, there are very few references available. Barns in my day were places where teens got high and partied, but in the 21st century they rebranded as marriage venues for middle-class millennials. Barns are simple settings, so all I really need is a reference for wooden walls, supports, and floorboards, corrugated metal roof, and hay piles. Post a comment what your favorite horror settings are. Is there a setting in a movie trailer that immediately grabs your attention? After banishing the default cube, I create a new custom cube. Blender's cube is 2 cubic meters, which is a perfect space for a figurative cameraman to occupy. The player character will be sitting down, so my intent is to scale the building to allow viewing of 3 walls and the roof from a static shot. During the gray box phase, I'm focusing on scale. I establish the floor, walls, and roof, then import the file into Unity to check from the engine's camera. Satisfied, I move on to blocking out the details. The wooden supports are the most complex structure, but because they will be mirrored, I only need to focus on one side. I'm checking my reference photos constantly because the supports are pretty complex. Modeling is a great opportunity to learn esoteric trivia. Before this project, I thought a rafter was any beam overhead, but it's specifically the slope beams under a gabled roof. Neat. These details are easy to overlook without references. I don't think any gamers would raise a stink over missing corner joints, but the spiderwebbing of wood is what makes barns timeless horror settings. We are used to walls hiding a building's internals, but a barn is evocative of being inside a great creature surrounded by its skeleton. While modeling, I'm making internal decisions on texturing. PS2 games use textures to depict most details people would model today. You can see here I attempt to model a trim sheet for the walls, but abandoned the attempt when I remember a lot of details would be lost later via post-processing. The PS2 is vertex lit, so I need to be tactical about my subdivisions. The floor is the most geometrically complex element since the player will be low to the floor. I can get away with larger roof tiles, and the walls are largely hidden by support beams. I'll be adding more details to this barn as necessary by my game, but I don't go very in-depth during the detail phase. I add an opening to the roof where some shingles fell. I also add a window above the barn door so the player can watch the moon rise, a visual indicator of the game's timer. I use proportional editing to mold a pile of hay poorly swept into the corners. Texturing takes me longer than modeling. As a low-poly modeler, you have a lot of shortcuts available to you, such as crunching down seamless PBR textures. I use some high-quality photo references, editing with the healing brush to make them seamless. I have a wood texture for the floor that I paint some black lines as a divider with metal nails. I reuse the same base wood texture for the barn door. I use a contrasting wood texture for the supports and modify it for the walls. A corrugated metal sheet for the roof and a transparent square for the window. Lastly, I modify an image of hay and carve in some transparency for use as particle cards. Particle cards are alpha-cut textures spread randomly over a surface. It's primarily used for grass, but adding some pokey bits of hay adds volume with little overhead. I spend a lot of time establishing the lighting. I'm using Retro Shaders Pro for Unity to replicate the PS2 graphics, but the lighting is either too good or abhorrent. I really like the look of this directional light, but it's too dark inside the barn. I added a large area floodlight to fill in the room, which created these beautiful long shadows in the roof, but now it looks like a mid-aughts PC game. So it's time for another round of gathering references, and this time I get to play video games while doing it. I remember Resident Evil 4 having some old barns in the village. Playing the PS2 version, it's impressive how much the textures are pulling their weight, as the game is flatly lit. I can see a few shadows baked into the ground around fences and trees, but not around other static objects for some reason. The textures overall are pretty low res compared to other PS2 games, but there's a huge variety of them, so the game retains a level of complexity other games on the platform simply can't match. Manhunt heavily relies on shadows to establish the mood of urban decay. I can tell where they use vertex painting for contrast, guiding the player to brighter lit areas. Shadows where the player can hide are flat shaded 3D meshes. Splinter Cell on the Xbox had dynamic lighting, but the PS2 version only attenuates Sam's entire model. The PS2 version still applies the shadows of objects as static meshes, so the game isn't that compromised despite the weaker hardware. Overall, the PS2's lighting model is very primitive. I need to develop my own lighting settings within Unity to get the look I want. I'll briefly go over the more important settings to get lighting I feel is representative of the console's limitations. Real-time GI and baked GI, turn it off. If we want baked textures, it needs to be done by hand by either projecting a black mesh on a flat surface, painting lighting on the texture, or painting lighting on the vertices. Pick a gray color for ambient lighting. Add fog set to the same color. The next steps are only available if you're working with URP. In the render settings, I basically turn off every feature and have every numerical option. Turn off anisotropic filtering in AA. The PS2 was infamous for its jaggies. Reduce shadow cascades to its lowest value. This gives your real-time lighting that signature soft, blurry edge. I'm using adaptive shadow probes because I need a way to attenuate non-static objects. I adjust their contribution to low values and space them far apart. Post-processing is a necessary step to round out the feel. To be authentic, you need an interlace filter, which comes with this shader asset. The PS2 used frame accumulation blur, but I think a very small box or Gaussian blur is a decent approximation. It also had really prominent bloom, which combined with emissive textures gives the feeling of looking at bright lights. The vertex lighting of the shader bakes color information into the probes, but not the texture, meaning I have to hand paint the vertices in Blender. I'm not about that lifestyle, so I highlight everything and select dirty vertex colors, which approximates ambient occlusion. Everything is kind of dark, so I have to increase the ambient levels in my shader, which results in a slightly washed out, desaturated look, a perfect fit for the console's vibe. I especially like how low lights seem overexposed, which is another quirk of the system and matches some of my reference photos perfectly. Using a simple cube map, I add some light specular gloss to the metal, which gives this backlight to the dangling panel. I couldn't be happier. I will be adding more details to the scene as I build out the scenario, but for now, it's complete. With a droning ambient sound, the setting is everything I hoped it would be. Hit the like button if you want to see more of my process videos. More on this mystery game in the coming weeks.